All right, if you let me sit down,
Yeah.
I will sit, and everybody will have fun.
And then you have, I have your, this right here, you have some.
Yeah, I'll just tell you when
Okay.
to switch the thing.
Well, I think what Paul elaborated and sort of went, on the question of that it doesn't stop. And, I would just add this way where you sort of do a presentation and you think back on all the things you sort of missed to say. But, it's funny how this Ruskin and his gang, they would literally go out and do these road building projects where they would brick by brick hand build these projects to promote this feudal agenda, right? But of course, they weren't the ones that were going to be building the roads and living the feudal lifestyle. They were going to be the lords that would have the peasant class live the feudal lifestyle. And I think what Paul said about what Hamilton did and what Mr. LaRouche has actually done to quantify what how you actually measure the rate of scientific progress as expressed in the economy, which this potential relative population density gets at, which of course is another discussion. But I would say it also gets to another point, which is at a certain point, this is necessary to make scientific and technological progress. Otherwise, we become subject to attrition. Just one example of this, the fracking business, right? There's an example where increasingly you have to put more work out. This is not even just getting at the fact that fracking, you're breaking down membranes inside the earth, which are connected to your water supplies, and you're doing this with toxic mud, and what the environmental impact of that is, and the human impact of that is. Not even mentioning that aspect. The other aspect of this is the amount of work that you actually have to put in. All the semi-trucks you're sending out into the hinterlands of North Dakota. Of course, Hal knows this more personally than I do. All the materials that you have to put into it, relative to what you actually get out of it, you're quickly approaching a point where it's a loser. Like, in other words, work put in relative to work put out, in other words, what you get with the actual fuel supply and what you can do with that work, becomes a net loss. That's what you call attrition. So if you're not making the technological advances towards the next energy supply and the next platform of human economic development, you just aren't going to survive. So this is what Mr. LaRouche refers to in the 4 laws. He says this is not an option, it's a necessity, an immediate necessity. The other side of this is that the ability to do that, if you think about a lot of what we can do in this room and how people got here, or at least sat in traffic getting here using their GPS, these are breakthroughs made by Einstein, right? Relativity and so forth. Modern economy wouldn't exist without his kind of breakthroughs. But those breakthroughs, which were beyond the senses. I mean, what did Einstein figure out? Relativity and quantum theory and things like this based on an observation? No, we still can't even observe those in the sense of being able to look at atomic structures. We can observe effects. But it is the breakthrough of those kind of scientific principles that is what it is to be human. It makes people happy. Makes little kids happy when they can make discoveries, makes adults happy when we can make discoveries. And I think that's the other part of this kind of economy, which is a human economy, is that quality of endless creative upshifts and creative breakthroughs is, yes, it will enable civilization to go on, but also is what makes people happy, is to be creative and not just be stuck like animals. So anyway, these are some of the principles, but I think Hal is going to get at what this development looks like, especially even in our backyard, concerning the West Coast and beyond. So maybe I'll just turn it over to Hal. Hal has worked with the LaRouche movement
Since 1991.
1991 and has probably the only feasibility study that is in existence for the route of the West Coast corridor leading up to the Bering Strait Tunnel, and actually went there and did all that work to make that happen. So
Thank you.
you
You want to sit down? Ann?
I'll
Yeah?
stand up
Okay.
shortly for,
Okay.
at least for time.
Let me just, you want to- we got to make sure the microphone's on the right side of the plug, right?
That's a good idea. Thank you, it's good to be here. Robbie, I welcome you from Vancouver, and I'll be talking about Vancouver in a few minutes. I'm very pleased to be here, and I am hopeful that Donald doesn't put a loaded .45 to his own head and try to shoot it, as he unfortunately did this week with healthcare in Iran. We've got to be in a positive mode, and that's very important for him. And I think his meetings in China between the 3rd and 14th of November will be very critical. And by the way, one of the reasons that Xi Jinping is such a good strategist, his father was a general in the People's Liberation Army in China, and that taught him strategy, as all good militarists do. First slide. This is the presentation. I'll be happy to make a copy for anybody who'd like one. First one, please.
This right here.
Right there. Oh, can we reverse this?
Uh-oh.
There we go. This is what we're getting to, a worldwide rail system. And I first proposed this to the Rush organization back in 1997 and made a formal presentation of it at the International Railway Symposium in Istanbul, Turkey in October of 2008. And it covers all the continents, and it centers on the Bering Strait, and we also, of course, have the Darien Gap between North and South America. Next slide, please. Now this is another view of the same map. But as you can see, we have a whole series of junction points. The primary one, of course, is between Eurasia and North America with the Bering Strait, but also between North and South America at the Darien Gap. And then we have the Tatar Strait between Russia and the mainland of Russia and Sakhalin Island, and then to Japan, and with the possibility of connecting Korea and Japan at the Strait of Malacca, and then of course the Strait of Gibraltar and the Bosporus and the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. Next slide, please. This is another view of the proposal for the One Belt, One Road connecting Europe and Asia with North America in particular. And I show the West Coast corridor, which I'll be spending most of the time today on. But I was just recently in New York making presentations, including at the United Nations, and connecting New York because it's the nerve center of the United States. But we're going to concentrate on the West Coast corridor today. Next slide. This is actually an article out of The Week magazine. It says, "What's China up to?" And of course the intent here is to try to make it look subversive, but the subversion is to the financial community in New York and in London because they don't want to have any growth at all costs, as Paul and David have very clearly said today. Next slide, please. I need to turn that one around. This is another view of the world connection of the railways at the Bering Strait that actually was proposed by Premier Li Kengwen in China, actually connecting through the Trans-Siberian Railway and the Eurasian Landbridge into North America. Next slide.
Pardon? When was this?
He proposed this 2 years ago. China has been become the leader in developing and implementing high-speed rail. And they have made great progress. It has dramatically transformed their country. It's been the basis by which they've linked it together. It's required developing an entirely new energy system as well as transportation system, and they are making enormous progress on that on all fronts. And this is something we in the United States need to emulate, but we will not be able to do it without their help. And this is a very important concept because we aren't going to get there by ourselves. Unfortunately, the mentality in the United States has degenerated to the point that we have allowed the financial community in New York to dictate a
no-growth agenda for us, and that needs to be put in the garbage can. Next slide. Now here's another view of the same thing with a whole series of corridors in North America, going to Chicago, and of course, ultimately to New York, which would be a great excuse for fixing up the tunnels under the Hudson River, among other things. Next slide, please. Now, there's a predecessor of this idea of the connection of the continents. During World War II, there was an air service between Great Falls, Montana, and Krasnoyarsk in Russia to actually supply through Lend-Lease material to Russian for the Soviet Union to fight the Germans during World War II. And this was all done by air. Believe it or not, there was a feasibility study done of actually building the railroad all the way up to Alaska and looking at the Bering Strait, and it was done by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. However, it was never built for the railroad, and the reason was during World War II there was a priority on steel, and the railroad wasn't high enough up, and so it didn't get built, but the Alaska Highway got built, probably under circumstances that the U.S. Army just came into Canada without prior notice or permission, and they just built it. But Canada, after World War II, said no more of this. And so we have to work on a cooperative basis now, but I think the basis is there to do it, and this particular airlift was a starting point. Next slide. Now, the former president of the Russian Railway, Vladimir Yakunin, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Germany in the year 2000 and also in New York in 2011. He's no longer head of the Russian Railway, but he proposed actually connecting by rail and road London and New York. And that would, of course, go through the Bering Strait. Now, they were talking about a bridge across the Bering Strait. In concept, that's a good idea. Now, the implementation during the wintertime, though, isn't so good. And when it's 30 degrees below zero and there's a 60-mile-an-hour wind and there's ice on the catenaries, if I'm an engineer driving a train across the bridge 200 feet up in the air, I would probably be a little bit nervous. So we better have a tunnel where it's plus 70 degrees instead of minus 30, and but that's much safer too. Thank you. Next slide. The proposed Bering Strait Tunnel. This is Craig Thorpe's work. He did a painting for me on what would it take and what would it look like if you actually built a tunnel under the Bering Strait. And this is looking from Wales, Alaska west, and you can see Little Diomede and Big Diomede Island off in the distance, and then ultimately way on the horizon the east coast of Chukotka at Ulen. I was in Chukotka in 1997, a place that's very primitive, very undeveloped, population of about 60,000 people, and but there's a lot of gold, a lot of oil and gas, uranium, coal, etc. there. Next slide. Here's a map of developing Alaska and Chukotka. Chukotka is the province in Russia right across the Bering Strait from Alaska. Wales in Alaska and Ulen and Chukotka are the two connecting points, and at the nearest distance is 53 miles. Next slide. Now this is another view of what would the Bering Strait Tunnel look like, both from a vertical and horizontal perspective, and the tunnel would basically be built in granite and limestone rock, approximately 100 feet below the water, and the water there is approximately 180 feet deep. So there's the longest distance underwater is 22 miles, and that, of course, is less than the English Channel Tunnel. Next slide. Now, there's a lot of minerals in Alaska. There's a lot of development. Of course, there's now been talk now of reinstituting, trying to develop the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is over on the east side with oil and gas, but there's also quite a bit of oil on the west side over towards Barrow, and then you have the very large Point Lake coal field, which could start as some of the initial traffic for a Bering Strait Tunnel if it was built. And that's something, that's almost 40% of the U.S. coal reserves are in Alaska, and about 5% of the oil. Next slide. We need a switch. Now, this is the One Belt, One Road, as it might appear if we can get to the point of building it. And this is our goal and what we need to do. Starting from Alaska, going down the west coast to Los Angeles and San Diego into Mexico, and then of course going to the east through Chicago, and also going east to Montreal and Toronto and Ottawa, and then down to New York City. And of course elsewhere in the United States, connecting to our existing rail. Next slide. This is another view of the same, showing the same network in a somewhat more simplified form, but it shows where these routes would be, connecting into the existing system, but upgrading it. Next slide. Now I will also show, if we had to move water from the north, either to recharge the Ogallala Aquifer on the Great Plains, which is running out of water, especially in Texas and Oklahoma, and also shipping water to California. And while we did have a lot of rain and snow in California last winter, it wasn't enough to keep the soil from drying out, which helped lead to these terrible fires we've seen in the last 3 weeks in California. And if we were able to bring water there, we might have been able to prevent some of the damage that has taken place. So that's something else. We'll talk about that on a separate paper. Next slide. Here's a combination of the rail and the water transport. Bring water from the Mackenzie River into Williston Lake, and then bringing it down to the state of Washington, the Columbia River Basin, and rail as well. Next slide. Now here's a map of the feasibility study that I was able to do for the Canadian Arctic Railway back in the period from 2002 to 2006, and it shows a number of the routes. Starting up at Wales, Alaska, coming down through Fairbanks to Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory, and then lines going east through Edmonton to eastern Canada and the Midwestern United States, and more importantly, down the west coast to Washington, Oregon, and California from British Columbia. Next slide. Now, the Bering Strait Tunnel is a pretty formidable project, but there's another one. And that's in the Fraser River Canyon between Hope and Kamloops, British Columbia. There's going to need to be a overhead viaduct with 2 to 4 tracks built on stilts up above the existing canyon. And those of you that have driven on Canada Highway 1 certainly know what I'm talking about. And that's going to be a formidable project. However, the Chinese have already built several facilities with their own high-speed rail system, so they would only be duplicating what they've already done in China on a massive scale. Next slide. And here's another view of the same network, but showing the connections into the state of Washington. And I think we would need separate tracks for freight and passengers in the Fraser River Canyon, completely separate from the existing Canadian National and Canadian Pacific joint lines, the double track, 2 single tracks running up the Fraser River Canyon on the opposite sides of the Fraser River. But it's going to need to have an elevated viaduct. And when it gets down to the lower mainland, starting at Aldergrove, and there would need to be a freight line going down for the Cascade Foothills Corridor to the east, and then a passenger line down from Vancouver to the south to Seattle. And we need to separate the traffic because it's going to be too much otherwise. Next slide, please. Here's a view of the rail in the southern part of British Columbia, the main lines of Canadian Pacific and Canadian National. Canadian National's in the north, where it's further, but it's on gentle grade over Yellowhead Pass, whereas through Rogers Pass and Kicking Horse Pass, it's a very steep alignment for the Canadian Pacific. But they all join and come down the Fraser River Canyon, and that is where there has to be a massive new infrastructure program in Canada and British Columbia. Next slide. Here's another view of the same thing. And we can see what would be the Cascade Foothills Corridor, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. In the lower mainland, it would probably be helpful if we had a tunnel under the Fraser River between Surrey and New Westminster, and there's a lot of rail congestion there, and we need to separate some lines out and put additional infrastructure in, and we need a bypass. The existing line is kind of circuitous, and I've also shown from the Southern Railway of British Columbia south, that would be part of it, but there also needs to be an extension along the Highway 99 corridor down as far as the border. Next slide, at White Rock. Now we're coming into the United States. There have been several proposals for a national high-speed rail network. Nothing has actually materialized. California is trying to get its system built. In Florida, there's a private sector proposal for a higher speed line between Orlando and Miami, and in Texas between Houston and Dallas by a Japanese company. And I would hope to see the Chinese coming in here in a bigger way than they are right now and to help move this along. Next slide. And here's another view of the same corridors showing where the major urban concentrations are. And of course we've got Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, the Bay Area, and Southern California as major urban areas with up to 50 million people on the West Coast. And that's approximately what it is in the northeastern part of the United States, which also the nearest thing we have to a real high-speed rail system is between Washington, New York, and Boston. Next slide. Now, I've shown what alternative routes for the West Coast corridor would be like, and from Vancouver through Seattle to Portland, and then south, and at Grants Pass, Oregon, my suggestion is we send the freight trains down through the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, and we put the passenger trains on the coast. And probably the most important reason we're going to need to build a high-speed rail system, including for here in the Puget Sound area, is affordable housing. It's getting to be less and less and less all the time. And we have to be able to move people at long distances between their home and their work. And the only way that's going to happen is with high-speed rail, because we aren't going to do it with cars on a freeway, especially when they're all jammed up. Next slide. And here's just another view of the same thing. And I'm committing heresy by saying we need to have the main line on the coast for the passengers, and that means from Grants Pass, Oregon, it goes directly down to San Francisco through Crescent City, Eureka, Ukiah, Willits, Santa Rosa. Of course, they have to get the homes rebuilt in Santa Rosa because of all the fires. And then down the coast route, separate from the valley. Next slide. Here's just one more view of it, showing where these particular lines are. And my own feeling is if we want to get this done, we maybe want to get the Chinese people in the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad to help, because I don't think the Union Pacific is going to be a candidate because of their lack of progressive thinking, being as they seem to be completely under the control of the group in New York, whereas Warren Buffett is a pretty good insulator. Next slide. What would the right-of-way look like? 2 freight tracks, 2 passenger tracks, all electric, and we're going to need new power generating facilities to make that happen. And that also means the other way around. Upgrading our transmission facilities. Now, I've shown the line from the Colster Power Plant, which interestingly, the state of Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission wants to shut down to bring power to Puget Sound Energy on the east side. And fortunately, Microsoft and some of the other high technology companies now want to have their own power sources, so that opens up the generating gap somewhat. But it is not a good idea to be shutting down what we have, and we need more nuclear power plants along with everything else. Next slide. This is the rail lines in the Puget Sound area. The Cascade Foothills Corridor from Sumas, Washington, down all the way to Tenino, south of Olympia, and then separately the existing line along the coastal region. But between Mount Vernon and Bellingham, we're going to need a new right-of-way, because we certainly aren't going to be putting more tracks along Chuckanut Drive. Next slide. This is a view of what the Cascade Foothills Corridor would look like. We're showing an oil train and an intermodal train, and showing the BNSF locomotives with the Highway 2 corridor right along next to it. Next slide. And these are the rail lines in the Puget Sound area, including more commuter rail service, plus the Cascade Foothills Corridor and the main rail lines. And then Sound Transit is going to need to expand its service and its lines, and we're going to have to be able to serve Olympia. That's something Thurston County should have been included in this from the beginning, and unfortunately it wasn't. And we're going to have to be able to get over to Wenatchee and Yakima. There is an effort now to try to institute expanded rail service over to eastern Washington, to the Tri-Cities, to Yakima, to Ellensburg, to Wenatchee, to Spokane, and there are some Talgo train sets available. Talgo Company from the United States is headquartered here in Seattle. Next slide. This is a view of the local Puget Sound rail, and I'm proposing a commuter loop all around Lake Washington, going up to Everett along the existing lines so that we could expand people's speed.
Get around the circulate somewhat better than we are now. Back there, yeah.
Have we got it now? Good. Okay, next slide. And here's just one more view of the same thing, of the same network. And again, we have to expand the light rail, and we're going to have to expand commuter rail, and we're going to need to put in high-speed rail. Next slide. Now let's go to Oregon. Yeah, there it is. This is the existing and proposed rail lines in Oregon, and Oregon is the critical intermediate state in this, and there is going to need to be an expansion of the rail system in the state of Oregon over and above it. This also shows the water, but let's leave the water for another discussion. Next slide. Portland. We're going to need to have a tunnel under the Columbia River
Between Portland and Vancouver.
Washington, and there possibly might need to be, if the decision was made to go with the BNSF line rather than Union Pacific, a tunnel underneath Portland for about 8 miles. So there would be quite a bit of tunnels that would need to be developed. And in spite of former Senator Don Benton, who's been opposed to all this, we need to move ahead with the transit system, including getting the MAX across to Vancouver, Washington, and north. Next slide. Now, one of the major construction projects, along with the Bering Strait Tunnel and the Fraser River Canyon, is the Siskiyou Mountains, and that is between Ashland, Oregon, and Hilt, California, right along the Oregon-California border. And I'm proposing a tunnel be built of about 10 miles long. Next slide, please. And that would show what it is. And basically, it'd be about 3,000 feet. It would be about 10.5 miles, and it would go from Callahan, south of Ashland, up the Siskiyous on the Oregon side to Hilt, and then there would be expanded rail service on both sides. Next slide. Now, one of the prettiest places is Mount Shasta, and I think you all can recognize that. And my proposal is that we build rail expanded, and I also show a magnetic levitation train riding right next to Interstate 5 along with the conventional rail. Next slide. And this is what it might look like if we had magnetic levitation in addition to the freight and passenger conventional rail. Elon Musk, of course, has also proposed the tubes, which is another alternative. How that's going to turn out, I don't know. Next slide. This is a somewhat exaggerated view. You can see you have the big mountains and the Oregon-California border, the Siskiyous, and then also you have the Tehachapi Mountains with a tunnel through the Grapevine. Next slide. Now let's go to California. That's where the main rail action is. There's a high-speed rail line being proposed between San Francisco and Sacramento on the north, with San Diego and Los Angeles on the south. But they're having a lot of problems not having enough money, and that has to be solved, and they probably are going to need some new alignments. I'll discuss that in a minute. Go ahead, next slide. And this is, we need to turn it around. No, excuse me, we don't. These are the alternative high-speed and higher-speed main rail lines in the state of California that could or would need to be developed. There's a private sector proposal between Las Vegas and actually going to Palmdale to connect with the California high-speed rail system, plus the state's proposal to go from San Francisco and San Jose to Gilroy, across to Madera, and then south to Bakersfield, and then across the Tehachapi Mountains to Mojave, and then down to Lancaster and Palmdale, and then into the Los Angeles basin with a long tunnel. Next slide. This is back to, there you go. These are some of the proposal of the two main corridors, starting from Grants Pass going down to San Francisco through the the Sacramento Valley for freight primarily, and some passengers, with the passenger corridor primarily being on the coast. And that's going to mean building a new railroad. The reason we deer off is to the east is north of Eureka, is we don't want to go through the Redwoods National Park. Next slide. The Bay Area. I'm proposing that we build a new tunnel between under Sausalito, not through it, and going into San Francisco, so we connect, and then with another tunnel going under the bay up to Richmond, so that you would be able to bring trains into San Francisco directly, rather than having to go through Oakland, and then there would be service along the East Bay as well, down as far as San Jose. Next slide. Here's another view of that whole operation in the Bay Area and in the associated Delta, out through Sacramento and Stockton. There's an extensive commuter service now, rail, but there needs to be more. And the line across Pacheco Pass between Gilroy and Madera needs to be finished for the high-speed rail. Next slide. This is another view of the rail system in California for high-speed rail. What it could be, including the possibility of going to Las Vegas, which there's already a private proposal, and potentially to Phoenix and Tucson, as well as through California to the north and potentially into Mexico. Next slide. This is the plan for the existing California high-speed rail system as it's being proposed, plus I'm suggesting a line along the west side of the valley, San Joaquin Valley, so that not all the trains go. Then the reason this indirect alignment was first proposed was that's the only way they could get the votes in the San Joaquin Valley and the Antelope Valley to get the initiative to pass, which it did, but unfortunately it also means there's been a lot of opposition and money problems. Next slide. This is what a line in the San Joaquin Valley with an oil train and a high-speed train would look like. I'm in the process of getting Craig to do a new painting of this with a somewhat different configuration next to the California Aqueduct. Now, California is a complicated place. Los Angeles to Sacramento and San Francisco, multiple alignments. The existing one along the BNSF Railway primarily, then over Pacheco Pass, and then another line separately down the west side of the valley, right next to Interstate 5, and the state already owns all the land for it. It's level, relatively, and it's right next to the California Aqueduct, plus having a line along the coast, because that's where a lot of people are going to need to live, so we can get affordable housing as much as we can in California. Next slide. This is a proposal for an intermodal network, not only to haul passengers, but potentially for trucks, because we have lots of trucks on the road, and I think that with the shortage of truck drivers, including the fact a lot of them can't pass drug tests, none of this is going to need to go by rail. Next slide. Now we get to the Grapevine. And the example here is the Gothard Pass Tunnel, which is the main section is 37 miles long. It would be a good model for the Grapevine Tunnel, which would be 32 miles. Next slide. And this is showing the horizontal and vertical view, and there would be a 32-mile long tunnel between Castaic and Grapevine under the Tehachapi Mountains underneath Interstate 5 for the trains and also to haul trucks. Next slide. And here's another view of the same thing, the Grapevine Tunnel, and also a tunnel for the high-speed rail from Palmdale into Burbank in the San Fernando Valley. Next slide. Here's Craig Thorpe's conception of the what the north end of the tunnel would look like at Grapevine to the south of Bakersfield with a multiple track tunnel at about a 1,300-foot elevation all the way between Grapevine and Cuesta. Next slide. And this shows the rail line coming into Los Angeles and the various alternative routes, most of which already have some commuter service. And of course, you've got the Alameda Quarter between the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach and downtown Los Angeles for the freight trains. Next slide. Here's another view of the tunnel, where it would be and what the terrain looks like. And as you can see, it would be helpful. One of the reasons that the rail line which was originally proposed in the 1920s, was never built is you had some pretty steep mountains to go over, and it'd be better if you had a tunnel, but private sector financing alone isn't going to get it done. Next slide. There's a proposal for a high-speed rail corridor between Palmdale and Las Vegas, and Las Vegas casino interests, I understand, are very much involved in that. It's in the environmental review process now. Next slide. Now, there's also some passes in, besides Santa Susana, which on the northwest side of the San Fernando Valley from Chatsworth to Santa Susana. There's some tunnels, they're short tunnels, but it would be helpful if we straightened those out and made that entire line for the coast route double track. Next slide. And this is what the elevation profile for a line between San Francisco and Los Angeles would be in terms of the elevation and where the tunnels are. Cuesta Pass near San Luis Obispo and Santa Susana Pass. Next slide. This is a tunnel at Cuesta Pass to the north of San Luis Obispo. It would be about 7.5 miles long, and it would eliminate a very circuitous route. Any of you that have ever been on the Coast Starlight know that you twist around at 10 miles an hour for quite a bit of distance, and this would help greatly reduce that problem. Next slide. And that's another view of the same thing. And I show the elevation profile. And the tunnel would be 7.5 miles long, and it would go from a 200-foot elevation to about 1,000 feet. Next slide. Los Angeles is a complicated place. And this is a view of the Alameda Quarter, which is primarily a freight corridor, but of course it connects to the various rail lines for the main lines of Union Pacific and Burlington Northern Santa Fe going to the east, both of which have between 80 and 100 trains a day, if not more. Next slide. Here's another view of the commuter rail systems, including where the commuter rail runs on the BNSF between Fullerton and Riverside, and also on the Union Pacific. And the Alameda Quarter east is the Union Pacific lines that go through Montebello, and gradually they're building new grade separations and double tracking that entire route, but it's slow going because there's not an easy source of money available. Next slide. And this is what the commuter rail routes are in Los Angeles area. Next slide. Now, intercontinental, and what's the future? Well, we need to build the West Coast Corridor, and that is a starting point. But it really needs to go down to Latin America, through Mexico, through Central America, connecting through the Darien Gap, all the way down to South America. And the Chinese are working very closely with governments in Peru, in Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile to have bio-oceanic rail corridors across South America in an east-west direction, and those efforts need to be greatly accelerated, and we need to connect with that, and that means the One Belt, One Road needs to be moved along. And next slide, please. The biggest obstacle, other than the Bering Strait Tunnel and the Fraser River Canyon, is the Darien Gap. It's a swamp, and it's about 100 miles long, and it'd be better to build along the eastern slope of the mountains and then cross between Ungwa and Turbo in Colombia so that we miss the swamp, and then we can connect to a South American rail system, which would certainly accelerate their prosperity. Next slide. And this is what the Darien Gap would look like. This is near Matiti in Panama, south of Panama City, and The American Kansas City Southern Railway already owns the Panama Railroad, and we painted locomotives to look like that, including hauling oil in intermodal containers. So with that, I close.
One question.
Yeah,
Who owns the Panama Canal?
Panama.
The Panama Canal Railway is owned by Kansas City Southern Railway in the
Oh.
United States, which runs between
Railroad.
Kansas City and Houston and New Orleans.
A question, Bruce's question is, you need to have power, some kind of energy. Is this gonna be run on electricity? And if you believe that we're gonna have an electric grid to support it, I'd be very surprised.
We're going to have to build an electric grid in parallel to the railroad. And it's probably all going to need to be electric to run across speed.
So we're talking about, electric cars and.
That's another thing. Yes. And actually, China deciding that as of 2020, they're not going to be manufacturing petroleum-powered vehicles anymore is probably going to help accelerate that, because it's going to force them to develop their electric cars just like they've already done with electric high-speed rail. And they've been marvelously successful, and they're going to force us to move in spite of all the inertia in the United States, and especially in New York. Not pointing any fingers at anybody.
The irony is we've involved ourselves, the CIA, in virtually every government in the world. We kicked most of that out of Iran. He was an elected official, and put in the Shah. We were active in Venezuela, all the Central America countries like Guatemala, Honduras, so forth. I'm hard pressed to think of a country that we haven't involved in. Suddenly we jump up and say, oh my God, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. The truth is, we've been far worse than the Russians ever thought about being.
You have to remember, the old saying is that poor Mexico is so far from God, so close to the United States.
True, touche.
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of, energy and the electricity, and what portion could be, dams, what portion maybe nuclear, and this would be new requirements, and would there be potential for dam power?
Absolutely.
Or, or would that be too far off?
No, it wouldn't be. It just has to be where there's rain.
Not enough probably to run all those trains and cars.
It won't be primarily hydro, but hydro will have a significant impact, including the fact that it can be used as pump storage for periods of peak demand versus peak production.
Oh, yeah.
And
I'm
also, do you see any fusion power potential and the
Absolutely. Now,
use?
the LaRouche movement has been talking about rockets going out to the far side of the moon to collect the helium-3. I'm not going to buy a ticket to get on that spaceship of Elon Musk because I wonder if it's going to be a one-way trip. However, recently I have had calls from several oil companies who are involved in oil and gas production where they have substantial helium, and somewhere between 70 and 250 parts per million of the helium-4 is helium-3, and that's the raw material for nuclear fusion, or one of the raw materials. Just in case. I've told these companies that, and they all, huh? Oh, we're just selling our helium. What about nuclear fusion? Oh, is that right? They're not there yet. Other than LaRouche Moon, there's nobody talking about it.
I think China's program, their lunar program is designed around this mining of the
absolutely.
helium-3, so
Yeah.
obviously we haven't made that breakthrough, but that's the intention. And I think that the deeper point on this is like that is actually an expression of real economy. Is you drive by, you don't say what's the existing supply of energy or the existing resources or whatever. You say, what do we do to make the leap to the next platform? And China is obviously committed to that.
Right.
Just real quick, if there's any
There's another one.
Other questions that relate to the other
Yeah.
presentations or whatever, Roger wanted?
I was just noticing there was a big area around the Amazon basin where there was no lines planned.
Well, I think if we can get the political situation in Brazil stabilized and have a growth government in place, Mr. Timir is probably not in that group, there is potential for the hydro and also probably a number of other resources there too.
Actually, just recently, the government's, I think it was Tamir and the president of Peru that got together on the bioceanic
Exactly.
corridor. So, and China has made it very clear they want to invest in that. They've obviously been doing a lot in South and Central America, as part of the spirit of development. So that's also a potential.
David, you should also talk about the Russians in Bolivia with Evo Morales. Oh, you're going to turn it over to me. Thank you. The government in Bolivia, under Evo Morales, is trying to promote scientific development, and besides lithium, they have substantial uranium resources which they want to develop, and they want to create nuclear fission and fusion research facilities and implementation with their somewhat dominant position, because they are now exporting huge amounts of natural gas to Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, etc. And those countries have all expressed an interest in becoming part of the One Belt, One Road.
John?
The question of Wilson addressed is how fast are these trains actually going to go in the time between, let's say, San Francisco and LA? Get some time so we get an idea of what it's going to be. Because you're also competing against airlines. And the other critical question, regulation. When I try to go from Seattle to Portland, a lot of times we go 35 miles an hour in areas because of regulation. Could be the rails, it could be the safety consideration.
If you're going to build high-speed rail, it has to be on separate tracks. It can't be where there's freight trains. Now, in California, they're looking at 2 to 2.5 hours between San Francisco and Los Angeles under the right circumstances. And if we believe Elon Musk, he's going to do it in 30 minutes, is too. Whether that's going to work out or not, both physically and physiologically, I don't know. But he certainly has enough clout there, because there's a test track already at Kettleman City, 5 miles long.
It should be noted already that, these, this year, there was the first Silk Road train coming from China to Europe.
Right.
I think we're up to 18 European cities that have now had these Silk Road trains. Average time for a container put on a ship via the ocean is about 30 days. Via the Silk Road trains already, just connecting pre-existing rail and maybe making a few of the additional connections, but is not high-speed rail, nor is it an integrated universal rail grade, so you could actually, because each country has their own grade, so it's problematic, so you got to shift them. Anyway, but as is already cut travel time for these freight containers down from 30 days by ship to 15, 17, 18 days by train. So that's already improving it, but I think the deeper point, and the point that goes to what Paul was getting at with the subject of manufacturers in Hamilton, and what LaRouche has developed with the potential relative population density, is you develop the potential along the pathway. So it's not just simply increasing your shipping time or decreasing your shipping time, making it quicker, but you actually have the development potential that lies along the way.
David, in addition to what you just said, Russia and China are now working on a high-speed rail link between Beijing and Moscow, primarily along the Trans-Siberian Railway, where freight trains are going to be able to operate at 180 to 200 miles an hour, and they will be able to get cargoes between Beijing and Moscow in 2 days.
And these are high-speed rails or regular?
They are.
Yeah.
Probably Chinese. But they brought Siemens and Alstom and several of the others in, so, everything kind of looks good, from a cooperation standpoint.
Is there any sort of like hybrid, high-speed rail? Like you'd have something, something still with steel wheels and with something else, or is it
This is all steel wheel.
it's all
The
steel?
Chinese figure that they can get the train speeds up to, operating at 350 miles an hour.
On steel wheels
Yes.
and no supplemented by maglev or anything, or?
No, maglev would be separate. And actually, you know, Elon Musk's Hyperloop uses assisted magnetic levitation as part of its propulsion system.
Yeah.
We should visit China. Look at the
Yeah, you
Chinese
would be amazed.
high-speed rail would look like.
Yeah.
Very stable, safety.
Yeah, you should.
You should go.
You
But
will
we
be
can bring
amazed
you
at what
over.
you see. What we want to do, they're already doing. It's already in operation
That's good.
for
You
them.
only have to figure out what they did.
Oh, we don't have to figure it out. We just have to buy it.
The other aspect is China has bought a company in Switzerland or Austria, Switzerland, that manufactures, a specialty manufactures the wheel sets on these trains, which are not your regular wheel sets. So they're high precision. That's how they get these speeds out of them.
Right.
Yeah, I was
So
gonna
this
say,
is
you get
cooperation.
wheel going at 300 miles an hour, it's a little out of balance, you're in trouble.
You're right.
That's why it has to be so designed so
Precisely.
precisely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I would suggest we, all of us, perhaps myself most emphatically, were long-winded in our discussion. We intended to have a lot more time for discussion, but we can hang out here in the room for until about 6. So if there's any other questions, people can come up and just discuss it. We have the literature table, but I just would say this, just in closing.
Here's stuff on the road.
Oh, what's that?
And the port.
Yes, and the Mueller report and the
From,
Silk Road report,
tar sands.
and of course, whatever financial resources you would like to throw in is absolutely critical to our accomplishing the mission, which, to come back to it again, this Mueller dossier and getting that out and blowing this whole Russiagate thing out of the water, of which there is zero evidence of. And, you know, Helga LaRouche's wife, she had used the image of Gulliver's Travels, where the Gulliver is, by the Lilliputians, just all these little ropes kind of tying him down, and it's somewhat the intention by all these distractions. But if we could free free Trump and the presidency, and allow them to actually do what they stated they intended to do, which is the collaboration with Russia, China, and this new economic paradigm, you know, we could crush this British imperial system forever in this zero growth mentality and actually jump humanity into a level that probably most of us in this room don't even have the imagination to see what it would look like. We might have the imagination that we would want it to happen, but we don't even really know the riches in store yet for humanity if we pull this off. But as you know, Helga has made the point, and Mr. LaRouche has made the point as well, this is not a timeless battle. It is now, and the detonator or the fuse that is accelerating the time to make the new leap forward is the crash of the transatlantic financial system. It's dead, it's gone. We have to implement Glass-Steagall, we have to implement the credit policy, we have to move forward on this development perspective outlined by this, you know, new scientific principles in action. So we do have to win this very quickly. So whatever people can do on the funds, but in particular, if you're not a subscriber of the Daily Alert, that is every day you get an email into your, you get an email that has the new Daily Alert, which is the most up-to-date developments on what's going on with the new paradigm, what's going on with this front edge of the strategic situation that you just can't get from the media, because the media doesn't want people to know. They want people to remain stupid and in the dark and so on. So definitely subscribe to that. There's abilities to do that, credit cards, etc. So, we've got a lot of work to do. We will be having, probably around the time of Trump's trip to Asia, another seminar. So we'll keep you posted on that. But otherwise, if there's any other discussions, people can get together. But thanks for coming, everybody, and we'll see you next time.